morning, everyone. Welcome. This challenge really requires collaborative thinking and fresh ideas and innovation. And the only way I know to do that is by getting together like we are now. So my talk today is very much meant as a preface to today's trip. The story of Buffalo Mountain can be told many different ways, but I'm trying to tell it today in a way that sets us up to have a good background when we get in the field. Buffalo Mountain Natural Area Preserve is a very prominent feature, as you can see, in Floyd County. It's a little over 4,000 feet tall. This site has a really rich cultural history in terms of human culture. At one time, it marked the eastern frontier of the Cherokee Nation. These lands were eventually taken by the British and then later settled by new immigrants, largely of Scotch-Irish descent. In addition to this rich human culture, Buffalo Mountain, of course, is rich in biodiversity and natural heritage. This large mafic mountain contains a variety of vegetation types, from summit grasslands that we'll spend a lot of time on today, a special type of edaphically controlled grasslands called barrens, down through the oak, hickory, and northern hardwood forests on the south and north aspects respectively, down to the base of this mafic rock where water seeps out in these slow water springs and creates these mafic seeps with a great variety of rare wetland plants. All told, these diverse vegetation types support 9 natural communities, 15 species of rare plants, and 3 rare animals, including 1 endemic animal. Welcome. This is the parking area of Buffalo Mountain. 28 years ago, if you came to this point, you'd continue in your vehicle up a road that approximately went that direction. So that was the original access to the summit. Some of the first activities that were taken that we talked about were the closure of that road, the improvement of this parking area, and then later the construction of the Oak Trail to the summit. But in recent years, we've talked about how we've had an increase in visitation, particularly the last few years. And so we had some novel problems developing right here at this point of public access. One issue we had was this parking lot, until a couple of years ago, did not have a bathroom facility. You look at a portable toilet with a nice surround there, it's easy to overlook, but one of the issues that having a large number of vehicles that have driven an average of 45 minutes to get here is that we ended up with a network of myriad social trails out of this parking area. So social trails, that's not a term you're familiar with, essentially refers to the informal creation of a trail by repeated trampling. And so that created the usual social trail problems of soil erosion, but it also was facilitating the spread of invasive plants into the intact surrounding forest. So it was rather remarkable the rate of change that we noticed in that those social trails disappeared in a matter of almost months after the construction of that structure. That, coupled with a sign that designates the capacity of the parking lot, gives us a place to talk about what the rules are. Without numbered parking spots, without a sign that says this is what full means, it's just simply more difficult to have a conversation about we're at capacity. We also, in recent years, with help from the public communications folks, redid the messaging on our kiosk. So every sign you can see there was custom developed to do one of several things: to educate people about why this place is important, to try to capture their attention with other messages such as cultural history of the site, and then also to begin a system of messaging that continues all the way to the summit that encourages folks to stay on marked trails and thereby teaches them how to be responsible visitors. Our assumption, if you will, is that the majority of visitors will behave in a responsible way that protects the site if they know what that means. Early attempts included educational signage such as this and this, encouraging visitors to stay on that marked trail, that Oak Trail, that mile-long trail. But quite honestly, after several years of trying signs like this, they all disappeared. They're probably on some wall somewhere now. So many of these signs didn't have the intended effect. As I mentioned, they were installed at key points like switchbacks or right up here where a social trail had been created that roughly followed the course of the old roadbed that I mentioned. So one of the first projects that we undertook in recent years to address this issue of sustainability was to create certain trail features at these switchbacks to provide a deterrent against social trails. And we also, if you will, leaned into the skid a little bit and recognized that people wanted a faster route back to the parking lot. And so we, in recent years, laid out a trail, this blue blazed ridge trail, to create a route that accomplished that goal, created a loop hike but was laid out in a way that was a sustainable grade. So we created a sustainable alternative to this large social trail. And unlike the Oak Trail, this trail was constructed entirely in-house with DCR folks here and volunteers. That was one issue of sustainability that we faced, one challenge of sustainability we faced, and what our approach was. We had another arguably bigger issue at the summit. In 2017, Natural Heritage Stewardship staff, as well as natural heritage ecologists, began to document extensive degradation at the summit directly to those three natural community types, those three barrens. It was enough of a degradation, extensive degradation, that the quality of that globally imperiled resource was downgraded.
So guys, you are currently standing in an element occurrence natural community, actually two separate natural communities. That's going to be the Blue Ridge Low Elevation Mafic Barren, okay, which you will see as we move up the trail. And the other one is a Central Appalachian Montane Oak Hickory Forest. And as you've seen, as you're coming up the trail, a change in community type. That's part of the reason why this is such a unique place. You're currently on a switchback. Everybody knows what a switchback is. Changing in direction to try to minimize your percent grade of the trail. However, a lot of people don't like switchbacks and they like to cut through a switchback to speed it up for one reason or another. Most people cut switchbacks coming from the top of the trail to the lower part of the trail. You passed one of these cuts right here, the other one is right here, and then literally at the end where we've armored it with rock is the third spot where people like to cut the switchback, no matter how small it is. So what we did originally was to place vegetative matter in each one of these eroded sites to try to get people to stop. Many people that manage trails do this. It was unsuccessful. Aside from the breaking down of the vegetative matter in the trail, trying to add it back to the eroded area, that's good, but they continued to do the same thing. So we took a harder approach and added this 3 strands of cable. One reason why I chose 3 strands is I went to Grandfather Mountain down in North Carolina and saw that the single strand, which was approximately 36 inches from the ground, allowed for people to go underneath it easily. So I went with a 3 strand from 36 inches to 12 inches above the ground so that it's difficult to go under it and or over it. I made it cable so it couldn't be cut, and then I swaged it because you can't unscrew what you would normally use for cable clamp. So it's almost tamper-proof. We use galvanized cable so that it would stand the test of time. I chose not to paint it black because I feel like over time the graying would be aesthetically pleasing enough. Obviously, that's always one of my concerns as to whether we're going to impact the aesthetics of the area, because I know that it's going to help. That over the past 2 years since we've done this, we've actually got growing plants in what was a completely eroded area. So here and here, we've got things growing back in that site. We've not seen any additional foot traffic go through here, and I look at it every single time I come up here because I want to make sure that this is actually working. The other thing we did is we did some trail maintenance during the summertime. We were taking out pretty big chunks of grass and other plants, so we transplanted that material from where we were doing the trail maintenance to the eroded areas, and virtually all of it took. So that was a really great way to salvage the material that we ordinarily kick down the side of the hill after we're re-benching the back of the bench cut on the trail. This is our second switchback dilemma. This is a technique that I learned from a trail building crew some years ago to try to shut down a trail, is that you cut saplings or cut limbs off of the trees in the area, whittle the end, and stick them in the ground. And so you have instant forest. It just so happened that it coordinated with leaf fall. So they were green and then the leaves fell off and it looked like it was supposed to be there the entire time. And once again, we used the cabling. The challenge for this particular area was there was nowhere for me to terminate it. And you'll see as you move around the switchback So what I did was I ended up anchoring it to the ground itself. It was more aesthetically pleasing to do that. I didn't have a post that I was going to have to set here, not to mention the fact that it's extremely difficult to dig in this area. For this particular cutting of the switchback right here on the corner, people would just cut the 5 feet. So what we did is we built it up. So we made it less hospitable to walk through there by creating a ledge. So a person would look at that and say, I don't want to try to go over the wire or this rock wall. This is called a cribbed wall. It's commonly used in trail construction. There's another one that my colleague John Hartley built right near Dave. And the same idea is that they're looking down a small wall. It's not as inviting as if it were a social trail that's cutting the switchback. Additionally, we did some armoring on this section, which is basically using rock that we stacked on top of each other. So we'll get some plant growth coming through it to stabilize the soil. But if people decided to try to cut the switchback again, they would be hitting rock instead of dislodging the soil and the plants that are growing in it.
Welcome to what we consider our sustainable summit, the Barons Loop Trail. First, I want to draw your attention to the soft barrier system that you can see. Serves not as a physical barrier to prevent people from going into the fragile habitats up here, but as a mental, informative barrier that tells people what we consider to be a sustainable route by which you can enjoy all the summit has to offer, and at the same time concentrate and minimize the extent of impacts to these grassland communities up here. So we've got a lot of time up here together. We can use that time to do several things: to enjoy some of these rare plants that are found almost nowhere else in Virginia, to look at recovery on the areas protected by the soft barriers, compare vegetation within and without of those areas. Also notice on the south aspect of the mountain, large grassland habitats, and this is where the Buffalo Mountain mealybug lives, in these native prairie grasses. Just beyond that point is an example of a hard barrier. As we head back that way, or if you look back that way, you'll see a large amount of Virginia pine brush that's wired together, preventing access to an outcrop just like this. And that outcrop is the outcrop that there was a photograph in my presentation of the quadrat of three-tooth cinquefoil that had expanded in cover. So that's an example of a destination area that was eliminated by a hard barrier, whereas this is a destination area that we kept accessible. In addition, the overall extent, as I said in the presentation, of the destination areas was reduced by about half. This particular part of the summit is kind of in the middle of the three Barrens communities, which are roughly stratified from south to north based on what the dominant vegetation is. But I mentioned the hard barrier that was built of Virginia pines that were wired together. That project complemented another management project up here. If you look at aerial imagery of the top of Buffalo Mountain over the past 70 years, this grassland habitat that you can see here has shrunken by about 30 to 50% due to woody encroachment. So in building our hard barrier, we coupled that with the removal of Virginia pines we knew had succeeded into habitats that historically were open. So that was kind of a two birds, one stone approach. And then the last point I want to make from right here is that image I asked you to commit to memory of the ruins of the fire tower. If you recall that image and think about how far we have come up here at Buffalo Mountain, it's a nice image of 28 years of progress.
From an aesthetic standpoint, we don't want you to see a hard barrier. We want it to blend in. People look at that barrier and say, well, why don't they want me to be back there? I want to go over there. It's a hard barrier. Because this is a fine mesh, you can't really see it that well. Even with all the leaves off the trees, because it's galvanized wire, virtually all those tree bark is gray. So it actually blends in really well even with leaves off. That is 4 foot high, 1/4 inch galvanized mesh, 19 gauge. Okay, so we wanted it heavy duty enough to withstand a blow from a tree limb or say snow or whatever. Not necessarily the weight of a person. The idea was to try to cut off that outcropping that Ryan told you about that is really in good shape. We want to keep it that way because a lot of people don't know it's there. The only way they could tell that it was here was that there was a major trail running down through here and several other points as you pass by on the trail. So I put this mesh at 5 feet high, right? That's to here on me. I'm not going to try to climb anything 5 feet high. The mesh is 12 inches off the ground to allow small mammals, amphibians, and reptiles to move freely underneath it. And any large fauna like deer or bear are probably going to move around it. It's only 200 feet long. And so what we did find was that people still wanted to go back there. This is one of the places that they will move brushy debris. I literally put a downed pine tree right here. The crown of the pine tree was this whole area, and they moved it. Okay? People will go to great lengths, so much so that they ripped the wire that we've had to stitch back no less than, how many times, Dave? Okay, 3. We take wire and stitch it back together. Actually, Dave has done the vast majority of that. And so we learned that you need something to stabilize that wire with. So we used the same type of cable that we used on all the switchbacks and ran it that 200 feet and put it through eye bolts so that we could then hang the mesh from that. So you can no longer just rip it down because it's attached to that top cable. People brought a side grinder up here and cut through that cable. Why? Blows my mind, because you can get underneath this thing if you really want to. So I had to swage the wire back together in order to, yeah. So you're gonna have that percentage of people that are gonna do what they wanna do. And like Ryan said, we're never going to be able to stop that level of malicious behavior. We can only try to curb it by putting in things like this. But for the most part, this has worked really well to deter a great number of people that were going down through here. They hit that mesh and they pretty much put the brakes on and probably turn around. We've seen a lot of recovery in what was a superhighway. I mean, there's plants literally growing where there was no soil left.
From this summit vantage point, as you look back over the ridge of the summit, you can see the relative proportion of areas that have been protected relative to the areas that have been dedicated to recreation using the soft barrier system. So you can ask yourselves as you look across the ridge of Buffalo Mountain whether or not you think we met our goal of reducing the extent of our footprint atop Buffalo Mountain for the benefit of biodiversity, and ask yourselves how well we were able to balance biodiversity conservation with access to the summit for recreation and enjoyment. We've completed at this point the Barons Loop Trail, and for our return trip we're going to hike the Ridge Trail with the Blue Blaze that we built to complete a loop trail hiking option here. So we hiked up the original Oak Trail and we're going to hike about a half mile back to the parking lot on this Blue Trail. Couple things to think about on our way down. This trail was built internally with DCR and volunteer staff, so you can kind of in your own mind compare that workforce versus a professional trail crew. Of course, the complicating factor being that this is aged for 15 years, but it has been maintained during that time. Also, from an ecological recovery standpoint, as we're hiking down, parts of this trail get pretty close to the old roadbed that was deconstructed that used to lead to the summit. So you can look for yourselves how well, after 28 years or thereabouts since a vehicle has driven up it, how that's looking. So see which vegetation, which species are pioneering that. Primary management the last decade in particular has been invasive plant management. Fortunately, the invasive plants have been pretty limited in extent. We've been able to treat it with just a few gallons of herbicide a year to keep a handle on the Japanese stilt grass primarily. It's a beautiful half mile down the ridge. A lot of nice rock work, a lot of nice trail features, so the trail lays very nicely. It's a fun hike and it's very popular too. We've used a word we're familiar with a lot today, sustainability. And for us what that means here is that what we just did, people can do more or less forever without making the place worse, you know. A road requires regular dressing by a bulldozer. You know, that's not sustainable, you know. And so, whereas a trail requires, you know, the shadow of a steward a few days a year to deal with maintenance issues as they arise, but that's a much more long-term sustainable way to access this place. Thanks again for joining us on this hike. Speaking for myself and my colleagues, we're always excited to share this place and its story with you, share a little bit of what we've tried, what our approach has been, what's worked, what hasn't, what we've learned. And I think the last point I want to make today regarding our project is that we're not done. You know, we're still learning, we're still assessing how it's aging, assessing the response, but two elements that are ongoing and hopefully next steps include: one, Dave and his position, the public access wage position we have, having that site presence, that's been a new important part of this and just absolutely critical. Going forward, that will continue to be an important part of our approach here. With recent additions to the preserve itself, we have the possibility to someday relocate the parking lot further from the summit, giving us an opportunity to make a longer hike to the summit, spread out the crowds even more, and at the same time increase the amount of trail there is to hike. So hopefully that can be one of the next steps in continuing this process here. So really, I think that for me is the take home is that our approach to sustainability hasn't really had a finish line. It's had landmarks, but it's definitely an evolving process, and we're continuing to learn as we go ahead. And so look forward to hearing feedback from you all and your respective projects and keep this conversation going.